I will write poetry on my own, just sometimes. I mean, if you read Melissa Gilbert's Big Magic, like if you're creative, you're creative. Like, it doesn't have to be a novel. It could be like, I write in a journal. I write in a journal from the perspective of my characters sometimes if I'm trying to figure out who they are, right? And so I don't discount that. Like, because I'm trying to get a book out every year, which is a little bit fast paced for me. I know people do go very faster paced than that and sometimes slower, but because my book series will be 6 books and I might do a prequel after that. But yeah, I don't discount that. And like I said, I'm finding satisfaction doing blog articles for different people, reviews of books, or, a little bit of that type of thing. So I don't discount it. I just, both with your interest and time is at the moment.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 376 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In today's episode, I have an interview with Dianne Scott, the award-winning author of the Christine Lane Mystery Series. The first book, Final Look, was a #1 Amazon bestseller, Kobo Emerging Writers Award nominee, and winner of the Crime Writers of Canada Arthur Ellis Award. The second book in that series, Missing, was a finalist for the CWC Excellence in Writing Award. Lost and Found and Sabotage are the third and fourth books in the series, and the fifth book is coming out in June of 2025. Dianne and I talk about the series, Toronto Island, which is the setting and basis for the series, the history associated with the island and policing on the island, and all of the research she did involved in that, and we talk about so much more. And that's coming up later in this episode. But first, let's hear a word from this episode's sponsor.
Ready to elevate your writing career? Join the Cruising Writers Group Sailing the Caribbean from Galveston on February 22nd to March 1st, 2025. This time, we're focused on indie authors, with special guests Mark Leslie and Aaron Wright leading a deep dive into the world of self-publishing. You'll come away with invaluable insights, but also great memories as you connect with other writers and explore charming ports of call in Roatan, Honduras, Costa Maya, Mexico, and Cozumel. Visit cruisingwriters.com to book your spot today.
That's right, as these August evenings and mornings here in Waterloo, Ontario are getting a little bit cooler, having to wear a jacket and even close the window at night and add the comforter back to our bed. I'm so looking forward to being able to go on this awesome Cruising Writers Cruise in the winter of 2025. It's sneaking up on us, I guess. So I want to thank my sponsor, Cruising Writers, especially because they're going to get me into a really warm climate when it's chilly where I'm from. But also a huge thank you to those who support this podcast over at patreon.com/starkreflections, where for, of course, $1, $3, or $5 a month, you guys support me and help me out in the time I put into producing the podcast. I do love you patrons so much. Appreciate all y'all, and thank you so much for that. Now, I'm going to roll the bumper, and we're going to get into some interesting comments this week. Okay, so this is fascinating. I love comments. I love interaction. I love hearing what you guys are thinking about, and I never thought of this before because I realized this is a podcast. 99% of you, maybe more, maybe 99.9% of you are probably listening to this when you're not near a computer or an easy way to respond. Maybe you're driving or doing some other activities while listening to the podcast. So when I ask questions and I ask for you to reflect on stuff, it's difficult. It's not easy for you to get to it. I do it all the time myself. And so that's that's life in the big city. But in my recent Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing newsletter, which I've not been so good about sending out twice a month like I'm supposed to, I sent one out just the other day on, I guess, August 21st. And I asked because I wanted to point out the editorial panel that was in episode just a few episodes back. And when I was thinking about, well, what do you call a group of editors? Do you call it a panel of editors? What's the actual term? And I have to share so many great comments. I couldn't get to all of them, but these are some of the comments that I got back from the newsletter. And lo and behold, oh my goodness, when people are reading an email that comes in the newsletter and I ask for a response, it's so much easier for writers to hit that reply button than it is when I say, oh, I'm giving you something in audio, please send me a text response. I'll have to figure out a better way to get those responses because I love your comments. I love the engagement, and it's so heartwarming. And I know that you listeners are going to appreciate some of this. So, okay. This came in from Mikey Campling. Mikey says, thanks for all your hard work in putting your podcast together. It's one of the very few that I listen to regularly. Oh, I'm touched. Thanks so much, Mikey. I'm glad it brings that value to you. Mikey continues to say, reading your email, it struck me immediately that it has to be a commission of editors, mingling as it does the noun and the verb forms of the word. Also, I came up with this some time ago and thought you might enjoy it. Old editors never die, but ever lower, left dangling, are their modifiers. I realize I'm taking a big risk with this joke, but hopefully it works. Mikey, I'm so glad you took a risk with that joke because it worked for me and I love it. I love that. I love jokes that take a little bit of a risk. So, and very cheeky. I love that. So thank you so much for sharing that. Laxmi sent in hyenas, as a group of editors. Okay, that works for me. I could see that. Julie Strauss wrote back and said, are you kidding me? It's obviously a murder of editors. So, yeah, because sometimes that's what they can do, or that's what it feels like to us. Reed Howie wrote back saying, how about calling a group of editors an anthology of editors, an edition of editors, a compendium of editors? Well, Reed, I like them all. I think they all work. They all make a lot of sense. Ann Larson said, good afternoon, Mark. As a devotee of collective nouns, I could not resist your bait. I propose a scaffold of developmental editors, a meticulosity of copy editors, and furthermore, a query of agents. Thank you, Anne. I love that you went into very specific types of editors. That's good because there are different kinds of editors. That is perfect. And of course, yeah, a query of agents is absolutely brilliant as well. So thanks for that. Liz Lindsay said, how about an intimidation of editors? Ooh, yeah, that is a good one. Dorothy Zemek said, oh, I have so many. An irritation of editors, a murmur of editors, a murder of editors, and Dorothy says, see attached image of freelance Barbie. I have a real one on my desk. But my two faves would be these, depending on your mood. A nitpicking of editors, an authority of editors. Dorothy also says, I have been on many panels, but those are a feature of conferences, not of editors. We mostly work alone. Even in editorial departments, people are working pretty individually, even though my trad books have at least 3 to 5 editors per book of varying sorts, but they don't all talk to each other that much. Thank you for the editor interviews. Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you so much for the great different types of editors as well. A great list that you provided me. An authority of editors, a nitpick. Anyways, so interesting. Dorothy said they're working individually, and I know with one of the traditional publishers I worked with, there wasn't 3 to 5 editors per book. There were 3. I had my initial developmental editor. Then there was a line editor who would work, and again, they didn't talk to one another because sometimes I would get conflicting notes from them. the developmental editor had asked me to do something, and then it was the line editor that suggested a different change. But that happens, I guess. And then, of course, there was always the proofreader. And I never really interacted much with the proofreader, because I think the proofreader was doing that work while I was looking at the manuscript, and then that was just going back in for the final one. But yeah, so interesting how we work so differently. Okay, on to the next one. Susie says, "Hey, Mark, how about a markup of editors, a correction of editors, a cut of editors, a bucket of writers' tears of editors?" Probably too much punctuation required for that one, Susie says. Yeah, agreed. But I do like that list. Thank you. And Matthew Del Papa says, an encouragement of editors. And that is a great, hopeful way to end that list. But I want to thank you guys all so much for this incredibly creative and fun and insightful list of what we should call a group of editors. Of course, if you have any comments on which one you want to vote for, go ahead and leave that in the comments over at starkreflections.ca, or you can email me directly, mark@markleslie.ca. But this was a reminder to me that maybe if I want to get some more of that interactivity from you guys, probably send it off in that newsletter. And if you haven't subscribed, there is a link to get that newsletter, which I try to send out twice a month. I try to highlight something that we talk about from the Stark Reflections podcast, or just the book industry in general, that may or may not be an episode. And of course, I always do highlight and try to spotlight some of the stuff that is talked about in the episodes. It's meant to be an additional piece of quick information about the industry. But I want to thank you guys all so much for that. And again, you taught me something cool. You didn't just teach me some really cool things we could call a group of editors, but you also reminded me of the way to incite, your creativity and your interactivity is text to text, probably, rather than trying to go audio to text. So there, I'm always learning. Speaking of learning, I'm going to roll the bumper and talk a little bit about some of my personal learnings. And so for my personal update, I actually launched my Kickstarter for One Hand Screaming, 20 Haunting Years, on Tuesday, August 20th. Now, I kept updating and revising, and I think I ran into an issue that a lot of writers run into, is I just kept revising the manuscript, revising, never publish it, which does happen a lot. And I mean, I had run a Kickstarter before, one failed one that was successful, and I did help somebody else out by being a collaborator on their very small, successful Kickstarter. But I thought it just got to get off the pot. And one of the reasons is because I need to get the final book files to the printer so I can get the book in the warehouse because of the traditional publishing distribution this one's going to have. And I realized one of the rewards was, the Kickstarter, you can get your name listed in the back of the book in the Hall of Screams. And I realized I got to get these names in. So I cut it down. It's ending on September 10th. It launched on the 20th of October. It's ending on September 10th. I cut it down to 21-ish days, I believe, something like that, from 24 or whatever it was. And I realized I got to get this because I got to get that to the printer ASAP. So everything will be ready to go except that one page that I can kind of just insert at the very last minute. Then I've got to get the special editions and all that stuff. Now, those don't need to be out as quickly because they're not going to get delivered till later in October, but I do need this trade edition ready to go, and obviously the ebook edition and all that stuff with all the names in it. So that kind of forced me to say, Mark, enough. You were supposed to launch this in July. Let's get going, buddy. So I launched it, and I didn't launch it till about noon on the 20th of August. Now, I hit my goal. My goal was $1,500 Canadian. I wanted to make it very, very reasonable because I wanted to hit it right away or as quickly as possible. Now, that works out based on exchange rate to about $1,102 US. And so, again, just a little over $1,000. Now, hit that goal in about 5.5 hours, which was great. And then it just kind of kept going for a little while, and then it kind of stagnated a little bit. So as what happened, I think I just got in on the second day. I only brought in $159 and just about $120 on this third day so far. And so I'm at $2,510 Canadian, which again is great. I'm happy. It's 167% of the goal, and that is with 64 backers. That works out to be about $1,800 US, so under $2,000 US. And I'll be honest with you, I actually need more for this project. I didn't, because you don't get any money if it doesn't fund, so I figured I'd rather get some money to get this going. But I am going to need several $1,000s just to print these books to get them into the warehouse. Now, eventually, hopefully in 6 months or whatever, when I actually get paid for those books, I'll make that money back. But it'd be nicer to get some of it back sooner by helping pay for some of the printing. So my first stretch goal was announced today on August 22nd at $3,000, which is twice what my initial goal was. And at $3,000 Canadian, which is $2,204 US, I am giving everyone who supports the Kickstarter, who supports the campaign, I'm giving everyone the ebook and short story of The Pizza Man, which is a horror story that I wrote. So you get the story in ebook and audio read by Chris Humphreys. And it also comes with, as all the stories will in the One Hand Screaming collection, a behind the story notes, the story behind the story. And so that works out to be just roughly about half an hour with the story and the notes. And The Pizza Man is one of the stories that did not make the final cut, because I had probably 40 stories I could have added that have been published in the last 20 years. And some of them, not all of them, were horror, of course, so I needed horror. The Pizza Man definitely was horror, but I didn't include it because I ran out of room. So that is going to be in a special digital Screams edition that sort of, here's a second book of stories that are all great, but they didn't work for whatever reason. Because again, I wasn't just picking the best stories for the collection. I wanted them to fit in the anthology in a certain way. So I've got this kind of story and that kind of story and the other kind of story. So I wanted to have a mixture of stories, and if the story was too much like something else, I had to leave it on the cutting room floor. So anyways, that's the first stretch goal that I have. And I'm hoping it'd be great to get to that $3,000. It'd be great, even greater, to get to the $5,000 Canadian. And at that goal is when I'm going to be able to make an audiobook version of One Hand Screaming to make available for all supporters who are supporting that Kickstarter campaign. But I've made some mistakes. I'll probably talk about some of the mistakes. Now, the other thing is I used the old Kickstarter, the people who supported the Obsessions Kickstarter. I messaged them. I probably need to message them again. I know it's kind of annoying. I've messaged my email news group, my Mark Leslie author news group, with a link to it. And I've had, of course, a whole bunch of people bail. People bailed when I warned them a few weeks ago I was going to be hitting them regularly. I messaged them on the launch day. I messaged them again today. And again, I'm having people bail. But that's good. Hey, if you want to bail for my newsletter, because I actually am reaching out to you and talking to you about things that I think you as my newsletter subscriber should like, and you don't like it, good, go. I don't want you there. I only want people there who are actually interested in hearing from me. And if it's that annoying that you have to hear me talk about this Kickstarter, well, maybe you're not a fan and shouldn't be costing me the money that you're sitting on my list. So see you later. Anyways, I also did include a link to it in my email that I talked about earlier in the previous comment prior to the bumper. And the reason I sent it out is because I do have rewards that aren't related to horror. I have access to a consulting with me that's basically 50% cheaper than you can regularly get it, which is $149 US for an hour of my consulting time. And I also have access to some of my digital versions of my books in the Stark Publishing Solution series that are, again, cheaper, a better price than you can get for the retail price. So again, I included them in my newsletter to writers because I thought, well, maybe there's some writers who are interested, and thusly, maybe there are some of you writers listening to this podcast who may not be interested in the horror. Who cares? I'm not interested. You can, put in, I guess, a digital reward for $1 or whatever it is, and then go into the add-ons and go, oh, okay, I want this book from Mark, right? I want an author's guide to working with libraries and bookstores because it's way cheaper than I can get it for retail, or I want to be able to book a consulting gig with Mark. So speaking of which, I haven't done this yet, and I do plan to roll this out. If you are a patron of the podcast, I'm going to offer you a coupon code to be able to get access to those consultations for cheaper than the standard price that everyone else gets, because I want to be able to give you those rewards. Of course, I'm a disorganized mess on the best of days, so I promise I'll try to get to it, as Belky would say. I'll try to get to it soon, cousin. But Belky Bartokoumas, Perfect Strangers, reference to an 80s, early 90s show that I quite love and adored with Bronson Pinchot and Mark Lynn-Baker. Anyways, I'm all about the nostalgia, apparently. Anyway, so that's where my Belky voice came in just for a second. Because we were all created cousins equally in the eyes of Belky. But in any case, that's it for my personal update. Thought I'd share. So one of the other learnings is what I should have done is I should have just scheduled a really short, brief, audio only. I should have said, hey, Reflectives, I just want to let you know my Kickstarter is live. If you want to go check it out, go to this URL, and probably created some really easy URL that you could get to. So again, something that I'm learning as I make these mistakes along the way. Yes, you can follow my mistakes live and learn from all the things that Mark does wrong. Isn't maybe some of the things that I do right. But that is it for my personal update. Now, I'm so glad that I get to introduce Dianne Scott to you. It was great. I met Dianne in person earlier this summer at a Waterloo region book event that was sort of a new book event that nobody had been to yet because they just created it for the first time this year. And we started chatting, and she was telling me a bit about her books, and I went, oh, cool, this sounds awesome. Love to have you on the podcast. So she agreed, and I was so thrilled that we got to talk about her writing and all the really cool things that she wanted to talk to. And it's always fun when I get to interview a fellow Canadian author, so I can share some of the slightly different things that we are involved in, particularly when she's talking about some of the other markets she's working with. But that interview with Dianne Scott is coming up very shortly, right after this next bumper. Hi, Dianne. Welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So let's get into before we talk specifically about what you're writing now. Let's talk a little bit about your origin story. And is it something you've always wanted to be as a writer, or did that come later on? And what sort of writing did you start with?
I don't know if I always wanted to be a writer. I like math and science as well as English, right? And you always thought that's the harder stuff to do, being a doctor. And I think after I wrote a creative writing piece, and it was supposed to be a research essay in university, and the teacher said, nice job, entertaining, D plus, maybe, go find yourself an English course. And so I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I could do that. I always loved English. And so that ended up me having a master's in English, right?
Really?
And
so you switched what your plans were because of that and teacher professor
that moment where she's like, what the hell is this? Right? So I was just like, it's St. Augustine, just rocking his world, right? So so that switched me up a bit. And at that time, there was no master's in creative writing like there is now, which would have been fantastic because I was always interested in that. So I did a master's in English, and then I went to teachers college, and for like 30 years I taught English and literacy skills and special education. So I still do some teaching now. I teach at Ronald McDonald House and do some of their literacy work, but and then not quite as long, but since university I was publishing and had a bit more of a literary focus. So I had short stories and poetry and nonfiction and essay published in newspapers and literary magazines and journals. And I was trying to go that traditional route. I still have like collection of short stories in my bottom drawer, a literary book in my bottom drawer, a sort of parenting book in I have many bottom drawers in my bottom drawer. And so, that was sort of the avenue I was going to go. And maybe about 10 years ago, my dad told me that a little bit about how he used to patrol Toronto Island as a police officer in the 60s. And so that I thought to myself, like, that's a really cool setting. Even though it's a Torontonian, I didn't know a lot about Toronto Island, right? I had gone to Centerville, I'd played volleyball there, I'd
Yeah.
paddled there, but I didn't know its history, right? I'm like,
Right.
oh, it's
Right.
a cool, natural, beautiful place. That would be a cool place for sinister stuff to happen,
Right. Right.
that contrast. And then wouldn't it be even cooler if it was a female officer?
Right.
Because I even knew then, and my dad introduced me to some women who had been officers in the 60s. Like there were 60 policewomen, and that's what they were called then, policewomen, and 4,000 policemen, right? So I'm like, that would inherently have some problems and internal
Right.
and external conflict. That would be cool, right? And so that started me on the genre line, because I know you're a horror writer, but I am really wimpy, right? The Exorcist was like, close my eyes, plug my ears as I watched it. So
Right.
I'm like, I don't have a lot of, grit for that, but I could have something for a character centered, series, where they
Yeah.
develop, and where there's all those things around community and friendship and that. So that started me down that route. And I was lucky enough to get a paid mentorship who, Diaspora Dialogues. It's a GTA organization that supports diverse writers. And I had the Canadian writer Marina Endicott, my mentor for the
Wow.
manuscript. Yeah, which was very great. And so I'm very appreciative of that. And they tried to get my book to some publishers. They know that's part of their job.
Yeah.
And nobody bit a bit. And then the manuscript won the Crime Writers of Canada Award for Best Crime
So
Manuscript.
you won this before it was published. You won the award for
Yeah,
Crime Writers.
yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
which is cool. They have it's really cool. So they have that. So that was very encouraging too. I still was trying to not peddle it. That seems like a something illegal, but to submit to traditional publishers, because I thought, hey, this is Toronto Island. It's such a cool history, right? It's female stories, but I didn't have as much interest. And as I continued to apply to traditional publishing to get it published, I started to hear about people like Joanna Penn, right? And people like Mark Dawson and his, self-publishing formula, and Sasha Black, and all sorts of people, because, you're waiting around a lot in traditional publishing, and that just seemed to be wrong, you know? And, that's a gateway to a certain amount of people who the editor likes going through. And so as I learned more about it, I started being less interested in traditional publishing, although I could have had it published in the States if I changed it to a US setting, which I was like,
Hmm.
okay,
Interesting.
the hook is Toronto Island. I'm not sure it's like, I don't know how you can say change the setting. And I
Yeah.
won a contest in the UK, and they were going to publish it too. But by that time, I knew too much, and I was like,
Yeah.
you know what? I think I could do this on my own. And, it's tons of work, or I'm not necessarily a business or marketing person, but you just have that sense of, I can have my own goals about what I want from writing. I can do as much time as I choose, and I can sell it for what I want and publish at my own timeline and pick the book cover designer and all that sort of stuff. And it just became too much more interesting to do it that way. So two
Right.
years ago, I published the first book in the series, Final Look.
Oh, so the 2022 then was when.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So
Yeah.
I want to take a bit of a backtrack. There's a few different things I want to want to
Sure.
pursue. So the first thing I want to pursue is you had mentioned selling some stories and articles and stuff like that. And as a fellow Canadian author, I'm curious about how did you find markets, and was it more literary fiction that you were selling in those in the pre-days prior to 2022?
Right. So the part that was literary fiction, I mean, I just did some of the literary journals, for poetry, and for
Right.
the short stories, I did do the Humber School for Writers, if you know that program as well.
Oh, yes, great
Yes,
program.
and right. So I got an agent through them for my short story collection. And
Oh,
so
really? So you did have
yeah,
an agent, a
I
Canadian
did
agent.
have an agent very
Okay.
temporarily, and she couldn't pitch it. And she had a
Right.
lot of clients, So after a while, I'm like, again, I had awards for some of those stories too. And then you're like, okay,
Yeah.
have a pause on that. So
Right.
for nonfiction, I think I would pitch it to like the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, and I was successful and stuff. I didn't publish like weekly or monthly. I would get the occasional one in, and I would just do the hard work of,
Yeah.
you're not supposed to, but spamming the literary journals, my one poem at 20 journals, because I don't, you know, if you're selling a car, you don't wait for one at a time,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
I'm gonna spam it all. I know you don't like that, but that type of thing. And so I was sort of like the spam type of person trying to do that. And it's really nice to go to a reading and read your work and get your $25 that you got for your poem and all that sort of stuff. I still like the literary stuff, but I still I'm just finishing some blog work too, right?
Yeah.
So I still like writing nonfiction or about things, but yeah, eventually, I don't know, eventually working on your own book, and I had the guts to do a larger series. I was a little intimidated by novel writing actually
Yeah.
as a short story writer. And so I guess I had to have the meat to think about what I could maintain, for a
Right.
while.
So you were inspired by your father's stories of
Hmm.
the 60s, Toronto Island. Now, okay, for people, now you grew up in Toronto, you said, and you weren't familiar with Toronto Island. So for Torontonians who aren't familiar, or for other people who aren't familiar, what is Toronto Island? I thought Toronto was an island in and of itself,
They people think they are, of course, yes. So even then in the 60s, you have the city on the mainland of 1 million people at that time, and now it's what, 3 or 4. And
Yeah.
then you have this small island, like a 10-minute ferry ride away, and it's
Okay.
very idyllic. It has a community of about 600 people. At one time it was actually attached to the mainland in 1850s until a storm broke it away, but it was
Really?
always been, yes,
It
yeah,
was
until,
attached, so you could actually drive out there at one point.
yeah, well, people weren't driving at the
Oh,
time. They were actually on horse and
oh, but you could
buggy,
take your horse over to the
Yes,
island. Okay.
yes. But even then, historically, because it just was a buffer. So the inner harbor was protected by this. It was basically it was just like a sand dune or something like that, because it's from the Scarborough Bluffs. So the Scarborough Bluff erodes, it brings wind down, and it made this basically sandbar, right? That's why nobody
Wow.
has basements there, right? And even from Indigenous time, it was a place where people like to hang out, relax, have ceremony, enjoy the place. And then it also had a bit of a carnival aspect to it, right? Because in the 1850s to 1910, it was like your everyman's idea of vacation. They could ferry across, there was hotels there was an amusement park, there were clowns, there were tea rooms, pavilions, dance halls, there was a baseball stadium, and it was sort of had also that entertainment, bootlegging,
Yeah.
gambling type of vibe as well. And so you have those two contrasts of this sort of illicit stuff going on, and then very wholesome swimming and skating in the winter, that type of stuff. So it was always a place that people like to hang out. And by the time that comes around to the 1960s, it's a place where the government's trying to have it completely as a parkland and sort of bulldoze all the houses and get the residents off. And that's sort of,
Really?
yeah, that innate conflict is sort of part of my first book, that between Metro Council and the people trying to hang on to their houses that some of them have lived in for like 6 generations. Like, if you
Wow.
think about the three major islands, Ward's Island and Hanlon, those are Hanlon families that continue to live there today, and
Wow.
Ward's family. So yeah, so it was a very interesting, and I think more dramatic history than I want, as well as I think,
Yeah.
people are stewards of the island now. It's a bird sanctuary, so it's a very idyllic, beautiful place that I think I'm staying there next week at the Gibraltar residency, the artist residency there. You can hang out there for a week. So
Oh, that's cool.
I
Awesome.
try to do that too, because that's wonderful, because there's not really any more hotels there to do that. Not too many, maybe a few B&Bs. So it's nice.
Wow.
It's a really special place, I think, and always has been for a variety of reasons.
Cool. So let's dig more into the book. So you said that your novels are set in the 60s as this is happening. So
Mhm.
give us the pitch. Like, what is the pitch for the series? The main character, you mentioned policewoman, and in a really not fish out of water environment. It's kind of like breaking, pushing the envelope, creating new opportunities, but also probably having to put up with some stuff, right?
Absolutely. I think I was just at a library actually on Friday night, where I go do a presentation on the history of Toronto Island. I read from the first thing, and my dad used to say that Toronto Island was for the lame, the blame, the yellow, and the sows. And it was basically, if you had injuries or anger management issues, or you couldn't hack patrol, or you were drunk, you got stuck on a Toronto
Mm.
Island for patrol, which always led me to ask him, and you were there for what reason? which of those four
I
apply?
annoyed my supervisor, probably, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there's lots of that. So
Yeah.
she's not very happy about going at the island. I mean, she's a
Okay.
she's a female officer. Most of them work in the Women's Bureau, and they did very specific roles like working with children and working with sexual assault and being chaperones at community dances. They're very siloed into specific roles, some undercover as well. But she needs a bit of more money because her family needs some money. That's over the background. And so she's like, sticking me in this backwater where nothing happens is not going to do anything for my career. I'm not moving up to sergeant anytime soon of, the Women's Bureau. And so she's not happy. And of course, they have their own thing. The first scene is her, seeing these two, the water taxi and a ferry racing to the dock to see who can get there first. And they almost ram the dock. And she's like wanting to arrest them for dangerous vessel. And like her sergeant's like, get a grip, right? This is island life. It's a little bit of excitement. Get used to it. And he's just waving to the pilot captain, see you for poker tomorrow night, right? And she's just like, okay, it's a different beast, right? Being on the island. So yeah, so I guess she gets to know the community. As Toronto Island, they've always had a very eclectic group of people, from artists to politicians to business people to, housewives. So it's a really interesting people who bond together,
Right.
talk about each other, and hear my story. They bond together to try to stay there.
Oh, awesome. So this is Christine Lane, and she's the recurring main character through that
She
series,
is.
right? Okay.
Yes.
It's called the Christine Lane series, or what's the name of
Yeah,
it?
the Christine Lane Mystery Series. So
Mystery.
yes.
Okay.
So she's the main character in third person, and she has a partner that she's mostly with, and she has three female officer friends that you see in and out of the series, as well as a few romantic interests that continue on.
So just for people who are curious now, what are the names? We got to get the names of the books in the series here.
The first book is Final Look, and that's when it talks about a lot of the conflict related to the politics in the island. The second one is called Missing, and that's where a boy goes missing from the island school. The third one is Lost and Found, and that's where Christine goes undercover with her officer friends to Yorkville
Ooh,
to
all the way
find
in a big city. Yeah.
very groovy to find a missing team and to sort of stop the toxic drugs that were sort of being channeled into the Yorkville at that time, right? Because as hippie and youth central. So that was fun to do. And then the last book, which was just published this past June, is called Sabotage. And that's when some wildlife is poisoned and a house is burnt down, and she's got to try to grab the saboteur before, something very deadly happens.
So what was so you won which was the manuscript that won the Crime Writers Award? Was it the first book?
Yeah, so first book is, and it also was on the shortlist for the Kobo Emerging Writers Award for Best Debut Canadian Mystery. And the reason why it's on now is because you probably know Kobo, they have this award every year, but they change the genre every year. And so this is the year it was mystery. So any mystery written in the last 3 years was a candidate for getting the best debut Canadian mystery.
Well, congratulations on getting on the short list. I know they look at a lot of titles, so that's really amazing. Congratulations.
Yeah, it was very exciting, and they give a really nice soiree at the Gardner Museum with an open bar. So much
my
appreciated.
favorite kind of reception is
yes, I hear you are. I hear you are a beer person. Yes.
So okay, so let's go back to the island again. I just want to understand. You said there was a school or on the island with 600 residents back in the 60s. Is that?
Yeah. So yeah, there was a school. I think I was actually just rereading it, starting in 1890s too. Right. The heyday basically of the most amount of people was 1890 to 1930. The issue was how to keep it as an all season place, because ferrying the ice and the inner harbor, just getting there, just like now we have problems with the ferry that's been for 100 years. Okay, so that was the problem. But people started living there. First they started to fish there and have fishing hunts. You had a lighthouse keeper that stayed there, and then people started just bringing their tents and then staying a little bit longer and putting walls on their tents and floors, and then wanting to stay there the whole year. And some of that's related to, after World War II, there also was a housing crisis in Toronto and that type of thing. So there has been a school, on and off for that time. In the 60s and 50s, it probably had the most amount of kids, which might have been several hundred at the time. That's in, and the artist retreat that I will go to next week is in the old school.
Oh, neat. That's good. So a bit of history there, right?
It's very interesting to have scenes from my book and writing and living there where my book was, where I have scenes in it. So that's really fun.
So let's talk about you talked a bit about pivoting, changing from the literary stuff, the short story collections, to being intrigued by your father's stories, and then that just inspired Christine, the character, and setting it in the 60s, which I can imagine is challenging for research because you can't just go, oh, and she pulled out her cell phone or anything, those things, right?
It's challenging, but then I don't have to do all that CSI stuff, right? I don't
Oh,
have to do
that's
the
true.
tech stuff. And the thing about being a female officer, and maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that, is that she's in a skirt and nylons and heels. She's got a
Oh,
purse. She doesn't have a gun, even though she's been trained to shoot one, right?
wow.
So
Okay.
in her purse, she has a memo pad and her handcuffs and a billy that's just about 6 inches big, so it can actually fit into her purse. And so
Right.
yeah, so it's old school sleuthing, I would say, in some way, because you have fingerprinting at the time, right? But I think the main thing about my character that people know is, first of all, she's 6 foot tall, very muscular, and socially awkward unless she's
Right.
policing, and her friends think she's a big square. So their job is to loosen her up a bit, right? And yeah, she's just, you don't have a lot of materials, you just have your own. Her whole thing is that when the homicide investigators move on from whatever, say the murder that happens in the first book, she's the one that's like, no, like, we've got to
Yeah.
find this person, they died on my watch. And so she has that tenacity, I think, to
Right.
go with it. But yeah, so I think the interesting thing for her is that she doesn't have a lot of those things, that are difficulty. And I do have maybe about 15 women that I've talked to about policing in the 60s, which
Yeah.
was very interesting. The biggest thing is that if you marry another police officer, you had to quit. Or if you got pregnant, you
Really?
had to quit. And so most of the women that I've spoken to only worked there for 5 years because, they didn't have an option. And so
Wow.
that's the area. But my dad would say, because again, they were siloed into a very specific job. When I talk about the harassment of, say, women in the RCMP now, he's like, I don't remember it that way. And when I talk to them, they're like, well, it's because they weren't in the patrol car with men, right? They weren't
Yeah.
having to compete or having somebody not show up. They were doing jobs that they appreciated, right? They were looking for a
Yeah.
one-right kid, right? They were helping them catch a purse snatcher by being undercover as the woman walking down the road. And so it seemed to be a little bit more, I would say, collegial, because they didn't step on each other's toes.
Right, right. Wow, interesting. So how important then is so we got time and setting and I guess time is part of setting, but how important is neighborhood and setting to you?
I think it's super important. It's the thing that made me fall in love with the series and made me a mystery writer to begin with, because there is something wonderful and poignant on the island when you're biking there at 11 o'clock at night and it seems like nobody's in the island but yourself. It's a super, super special place. And I
Right,
think also, and my even in my talk, it's like, what does it give you, right? It has to give you some plot and conflict. Like, it has to give you some opportunity for my character to develop as she slowly falls in love with the island and its people, right?
right,
It has to be a place where you can integrate some of the themes that are important to me. And in my books, equity and social justice is important, female friendship is important, and community is important. And so when you have an island like that where you can really elaborate on that, I think it's fantastic. And then also contrast, because if the one thing we know about police forces, they're very conservative and old fashioned. And so the 60 might be a time of Yorkville, the heyday, everybody, political activism, Martin Luther King, the rise of feminism. That's not happening so much in the police force, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
you have that again, that sort of old versus new conflict that also I think can add some layers to the story.
Well, no, I was just reading a book about the history of Pride in Toronto,
Mm-hmm.
June having just passed, and talking about some of the stuff that used to happen where people would get driven out to remote places on the beaches and beaten for their
Yes.
lifestyle, which was pre-80s. So obviously we're in a completely different time period and other challenges that I imagine if you're in the police force and are a progressive thinker, it's probably difficult, I imagine.
I think so. And even that whole, I've researched that a little bit with respect to my book. I mean, if you know anything about Toronto, that has a clothing optional beach on Hanlon, and even in the 60s, that always has been. And it's a place where queer people and LGBTQ plus found it sort of a safe place to meet. And it always has been. And I do have
Right.
a police officer in the book who does some brutal stuff to some of the people
Um,
there, right? And so the second thing to say is for the women in the police force, right? There used to be some stereotyping a little bit that, you're there to get married or you're there you're a lesbian. Like,
Yeah.
that's your
Yeah.
two options as a policewoman. Why else would you be on here? And
Yeah.
some of them were, and some, it's interesting because some of them, one of the first sergeants had a partnership with another woman, and the women sort of just like, yeah, like took it in stride. It wasn't out
Right.
there, it wasn't in their faces. People knew about it. They were probably together for 50 years and never actually came out about it. But yeah, so not a great definitely not a place in the police force for that, but there's definitely places in Toronto where people went, and lesbians went to do that. So I have a little bit of a theme with that, as one of the characters is lesbian and not particularly out, because it is an important thing. And
Yeah.
again, contrasting a time of milk and trying rising rights for LGBTQ, but not right.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that seems to be always rising but not, and so that conflict and contrast is interesting for me.
So I'm also curious, when you're writing about a historical period, the only thing that comes to mind about Canadian historical mysteries would be the Murdoch mysteries from Maureen Jennings, who's obviously a mystery writer that
Yeah.
really goes back in time, of course.
Yeah, although she did write a review for my book, so that was very cool.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh, that
Yeah,
is so amazing.
she's awesome. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. But I guess what I was thinking of is, so it's set in particular years. So you've got 4 books. Do they take place like, this is in 1960, whatever, this is 1916, whatever. And then how much of what's happening in the world impacts that? So for example, when in Sabotage, I think is the one where they go to Yorkville.
No, Lost and Found, the third one. Yeah,
Oh, the Lost and
third
Found.
one.
Sorry,
Lost and Found. Yeah.
So obviously, the transit system of the time and how they got around, even the ferry system, that would be different than it was today, I imagine.
Right.
There's probably a significant amount of research you've had to do there.
There is definitely, I like historical fiction. I think you do too. So I can go down that rabbit hole too easily and for too long as I'm rereading some of the stuff. I guess there's a couple of things I do. I do find, I get books on it. Toronto has a great archives, and Ontario has great archives.
Right.
I've interviewed a whole bunch of islanders to ask them what it was like, at that time, as well as the policewoman, as well as people who went to Yorkville, right? I even have some other teachers, because people went down to Yorkville music like when they were 12. Like, so these people are not dead now. They're like 72 or something like that. And they're like, I remember that. In my talks, I have people like, I was there, Dianne. I was there. I'm like, oh, good. So yeah, I do like to talk to people to get the ambience. I do like to do some research. I mean, eventually you have to do a leap of faith. So although I'm super informed by history, I like to, for example, there's Mariposa that happened on the island. I like to include that. Really cool to do something with that. So I do like to include it, but like, I'm a fiction writer. I can make up stuff, right? And I do give myself a little bit of leeway for that, but I like to get the atmosphere right. And so I do that through tons of research and trying to talk to anybody who is around, and that's why I guess I do some historical tours. I did a author tour of Yorkville last summer, which was lots of fun. Yeah, even though a lot of it has been bulldozed, and there's, as you know, it's very she now and not particularly hippie, but found a few traces of the past there. So yeah, I think you have to balance that. But again, I would say first person rendering and looking at some of the documents and hanging out and talking to people are helpful. And then just give yourself that opportunity to, fabricate or switch stuff around that you need to, right? Make the story work for you as a writer.
Cool. Now you mentioned a talk you gave at a local library on Friday, and I want to talk a little bit about how, because it's set in a historical period in Toronto, because it's set in a very specific area that has a feel and a vibrancy to it, how does that impact or influence your ability to market your books and your writing?
I mean, I think it's definitely a hook, right? I have my books in most of the GTA libraries now just because of that, right? I don't have them necessarily. I have them in some bookstores, but that's a little bit more hand peddling and on consignment. And if you talk about, where you want to put your money, like you put your money or you put your time, I think as a writer, what's important to you. And I want to sell more. I don't want it as a full-time job. I like meeting people in person. So that's why we met at a vendor, activity. Toronto Island has this fantastic Christmas boutique where I sell out all my books every December because people come and buy all my books.
Well, of course, they make amazing gifts, right? It's perfect.
Yes. And all moms like mystery and murder. Just telling you, just like this is for my mom. All right. All right. There's a whole bunch of moms out there that are that are in the market. So yeah, it's definitely, I mean, that's why the, Toronto Public Library specifically, will hire me for that. They want local history. I was at the
Right.
reference library, which is right beside Yorkville, right? And so that's why they wanted to know. I
Yeah.
was at the library on Friday at North York, and she said, "Can you integrate some North York history into your presentation?" I'm like, "Sure." The police college was in North York. I can tell you all about the police college because my dad worked there. So yeah,
Right.
you can do that for sure. I think it's definitely a calling card. I think it's one of the reason people, yeah, they like to see it there. And I've had people who grew up in the island. They email me all the time to say, you got most of it right. Like
Yeah.
most of it,
Yeah.
like they're like, oh, it was so cool. It's just like when you see a film that was filmed here, right? You're like, oh, I know that's Under the Gardener, or I know that corner,
Yeah.
right? Oh, that's like, Kensington. So it's the same thrill I think people get because most Torontonians have been to the island as well as many other visitors. It's really cool to think of that space being inhabited, 60 years ago by the story. So I like seeing it myself. And I think that from some of the emails, people enjoy that too.
That's awesome. That is great. Now, prior to the interview beginning, you'd shared a note with me about uh, the first 2 years of indie publishing, the good, the bad, and the inspiring, and the
Oh,
inspiring.
I didn't say the ugly, no.
No, no, turn that into inspiring.
Yeah, I think the ugly is the top load money you have to put into getting the book, there, right? Without any sales, you got to, pay for all the software and the formatting and your book cover designer, right? But again, I think for me as a person who's interested in agency and that type of stuff and equity, I find, the traditional market just non-equitable. And so that's really great. I also really love the collegiality of, self-publishing. I'm on Wide for the Win. I have consultations with Aaron Wright, who I, every 6 months as a person. There's people that you can, pay for their courses like Mark Dawson, which I have the course, or David Goem, right? That I have his free course. And there's tons of podcasts, like your Draft 2 Digital podcast that I listen to. This is why when I first met you, I'm like, I have heard you, seen you, talk to you so much. I feel like I know you. I hope you feel like I'm stalking you when I introduce myself, but I know who you are because you're Canadian and you're self-publishing expert and guru. And so, yeah, I just think that it's just really exciting for me to be able to have that information and people to help each other out. And I try to, I mean, I'm not super successful by any means, but I definitely have people that come up to me who are new writers, and I give them lots of information. It's all the resources that we talked about. It's,
Right.
it's Sasha Black and, the Indie Author Podcast, and all the free information and seminars are out there. It's the Kobo Podcast, or go talk to them. So there is lots of, it takes a lot of time and research, but there's information and collegiality out there, which I really like, and people finding the pathway that works for them and their specific writer goals.
Awesome. Awesome. I love that. Now, you had mentioned previously about the work you do at Ronald McDonald House. Let's talk about the importance of literacy and why you dedicate, volunteer hours and time to supporting it.
Sure. I mean, I think that yeah, I think just like in writing, where like for me, my goals are making a certain amount of money off my intellectual property and meeting up with writers and readers. I think that everybody has something to offer the world too, as you, I think, have volunteered your time, countless hours helping self-publish it. I know it's a business for you, but you also done countless of other unpaid volunteer situations. And so, because my area of expertise is teaching struggling readers how to read,
Right. Right.
so yeah, that's my area. And, just like anything, there's a science to it. It's not, there's lots of data on how to do that most effectively for kids who are struggling, and so for Ronald McDonald House, which is a very special place where, children go to have some treatment in a local hospital, and it's them or their siblings that are in the school. It's just a safe place to be, and it's a great place to work. It's a very small one. It's like a K-8 one-room schoolhouse type of thing. There's a couple of teachers, but
Right.
there's a lot of stuff that happens together, which is very cool. And yeah, it's a special place that I think to work, and I feel blessed to do that. I'm just signed up for actually two things in another area is teaching adult literacy, because I think that, if you're 40 years old and you're lack of reading proficiency interferes with your success in the world and filling out
Yeah.
applications and that type of stuff. And I think it's just because at that time they probably didn't know how to target and effectively help people. And so I do that, and I've just signed up to help. There's an organization called Canadian Women for Afghan Women, and I'm signed up to do online conversational English with middle school girls who are living in Afghanistan, and trying to go to school. And as
Right.
they've had over 1,000 days of non-school for girls there. So, if they're courageous enough to try to find a computer and do it, I'm happy enough to, talk to them in English. So I think it's important to do what, floats your boat and fulfills you, and give back, as well as, be a business person and try to, make some money off your intellectual property. You're sort of, everybody's trying to do that yin yang in their life.
Right, right. Awesome, awesome. So speaking of that balance, now when you started off in writing and the masters and all the work that you did, and you've got some trunk novels or drawer novels and stuff
Bottom
like
drawer novels, yes.
so you've got success with this mystery series. You're obviously enjoying it. The readers are enjoying it. It's well-rounded. Are there opportunities or options where you're wondering what to do with the other work, or is the focus now, okay, I've got this mystery series and that's taking up most of my time?
I haven't excluded it. I think that you have a limited amount of time because I work and I have a family and other obligations, and I play pickleball. So all those things take time
Yeah.
up, but I haven't totally done it. I will write poetry on my own just sometimes. I mean, if you read, I'm trying to remember, unless Gilbert's Big Magic, like if you're creative, you're creative. Like, it doesn't have to be a novel. It could be like, I write in a journal, I
Yeah.
write in a journal from the perspective of my characters sometimes if I'm trying to figure out who they are. Right. And so
Right.
I don't discount that. Like, because I'm trying to get a book out every year, which is a little bit fast paced for me. I know people do a very faster pace than that, and sometimes slower, but because my book series will be 6 books, and I might do a prequel after that.
That
But
sounds like
yeah,
more than two a year, or more than one a year.
no, it's because by the time I had pitched my first book, I had written my second book. You know how
Ah,
it, because
so you
it's so
had them.
long.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
the first one was out. I'm like, all right, 6 months later, the second one's out because it was already written, right? And the
Right.
third one. So I had three in, like, basically a year. Sorry.
Right.
And then after that, I sort of am on the thing of once every year, and that's enough speed for me. I think we'll go from there. So yeah, I don't discount that. And like I said, I'm finding satisfaction doing blog articles for different people, reviews of
Right.
books, or a little bit of that type of thing. So I don't discount it. I just both with your interest and time is at the moment
Yeah.
to do it. But yeah, I'm doing an article. I think a blog. My next one is using Yorkville as a setting. So I'm going
Ah,
to talk
cool.
about how groovy
Awesome.
that was. So yeah,
Awesome.
so that sort of gets to float your boat of something a little bit different. But yeah, that's okay. I'm still interested in that. I still read a lot of literary stuff from Canadian writers. So
Yeah.
back in my mind.
Good stuff. All right, so let's harken back to Dianne, who was given that advice from a professor. You should be doing something more creative.
Right.
So what's if you were to be able to talk to her, or a beginning writer who's thinking, oh, okay, this is something I'm going to explore. What's some advice you would want to offer that writer?
I think there's a couple of things. It's find your kin, right? Like, I think for me, I went to the library 25 years ago and, went to a writers in residence who gives you feedback on your writing. And that's how I met my writers group, because she had a group thing, right? And I have two writings groups, like, from 25 years ago from a library experience. And so find find the people you want to hang out to talk about that, get informed yourself, and like do a course. I've done U2T course in short story writing. Like, I've done the Humber School for Writers. Like, write and see what you like. Find people. And I guess my last thing is, don't be judgmental about yourself. Like, I really thought I wasn't a writer until I had a traditionally published novel out. And so what are you disregarding 30 years of creativity? It
Yeah.
doesn't make sense. And so don't don't give yourself that shutdown filter of certain expectations of the right thing to write, whatever that is. And so just be open-minded, find some people who like to write too, and do some homework,
Awesome.
and write a lot.
A lot.
And write.
Yeah.
Don't talk about just writing, as we all do. Talk a lot about it and then not write today. So got to
Yeah.
remember to do that too.
Awesome. So Dan, where can my listeners find out more about you?
So I'm at diannescottauthor.com. You'll see my own website, and I sell my books from there. And I'm on that same name. I'm on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn.
Awesome. And recommending any Canadian readers out there ask for your books at their local library so you as a Canadian author can benefit from public lending rights.
Yes, no, absolutely. Please do that. Recommend it. They're on Amazon. I have my own website on PayHip. So wherever you want to get it, that'd be great. I'm always looking forward to new readers.
Awesome. Dan, thanks so much for hanging out with me today.
Oh, great. Thanks. It's been enjoyable. Thanks for your time.
Great interview with Dianne. So glad I am lucky enough to be able to share that with you. I'm curious about what your reflections are, but my reflections from listening back to that interview were it was just fascinating because I've done a lot of research both for fiction as well as for nonfiction, but the numerous types of research that Dianne did for this mystery series set on Toronto Island. Now, because it was set in a specific place and because it was set in a specific time period, all of the things she did. So obviously her father, who worked in that realm back in the day, she got some insights directly from him about that. She was able to leverage the library. She was able to leverage local historic publications. She was able to do historic tours, like Yorkville tour, where one of the novels is primarily set, and then speaking to different people who lived on Toronto Island or lived in Yorkville in that area during the time, so she could get a real authentic view of what it was like. And I love how she chose to take, not like her father's perspective, but she took it from the perspective of a woman and all the different elements and things they had to deal with. Well, no, they weren't allowed to carry guns. They were trained, but they never got to carry them and stuff like that. And just how different that was than the typical cop drama of today. And just going back to the 60s and so many of the social aspects she pulled into it, which I really think adds an air of authenticity and genuineness, and just adds a whole new flavor to the mysteries. Now, it's clear how and why she won so many awards, because obviously the heart that she put into it is really reflected, and people who are reading it are picking up on that. So that is just amazing. Now, the other thing, and I used this in the call out at the beginning of the episode, so it should be no surprise I wanted to reflect on it, was that Melissa Gilbert, the method or the reflection that creativity did not have to be a specific thing. It did not have to be writing a novel. It could be journal writing. It could be poetry. It could be writing a blog article. It could be some nonfiction article that you're pitching to some sort of market. That what's more important is the creative, is exercising the creative spirit and leveraging that in whatever way feels good at the time. Now, I guess this struck me because during the early part of the pandemic, I was struggling with my own creativity, and I was not able to write the things I wanted to write that I had planned to write. And that's when I turned to doing video dad jokes and parody videos with my partner Liz, and just how that, doing the creativity in a different way helped remind me of the critical important factor. I am a storyteller. And my method of storytelling may not always be in novels and short stories and whatever. My method of storytelling may be what I'm doing now as a storyteller of the host of this podcast. It may be what I just did this last weekend at When Words Collide in Calgary. And hey, hello to all the awesome people that I had a chance to chat with and talk about that. I just love it. It warms my heart so much when people talk about enjoying the show, and that made me feel so special and amazing and awesome. But again, the storytelling that happens at those in-person conferences, not even when you're on a panel and doing the panel discussions, but the storytelling. Went out to lunch with a bunch of amazing writers, and it was great because several of the writers didn't know one another, and I was so glad that I got to introduce them to one another. And as everyone was sitting around the table and just sharing their own, like, well, what do you do and what do you write? Tell me a little bit about yourself. That was amazing, because even some of the friends that I've known for a little while, it was great to hear rehear their origin story, a little bit about them, because sometimes you know someone, but then you're like, oh yeah, I forgot that cool element. Anyways, that's all storytelling. And the various other things that I do are storytelling. So that element of creativity that Dianne was talking about, if you can't tell, really spoke to me and got me really enthusiastic as a good reminder of it doesn't matter what I'm creating, just that I am creating something. And so if you're down on yourself and you're beating yourself up because you're not getting the words down for your longer project or whatever the project is that you're working on, you're probably being creative in other ways. It could be cooking. It could be redecorating your room. It could be any of those other things that we procrastinators love to do other than write. But don't beat yourself up because you're just exercising that creativity in a different way. And it's okay to enjoy those moments, because those moments are what make life magical. You being creative in whatever way you're being creative makes life better. Really, it does. So thank you for being a creative person. Thank you for being a listener to this podcast. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Dianne. I hope you enjoyed the reflections and all the other bits that come with the episode. It feels good to be back doing full-length episodes with interviews. I have so many more interviews. I just recorded a few more in the last week that are coming up in the queue that I'm really thrilled to get to with you, and I want to thank you so much for your patience with me the last month or so as I was bumbling about and doing really short episodes or even sweary episodes where I freaked out because that technology wasn't working. I mean, it even broke during this recording of the podcast, but I only lost about 5 minutes, so it wasn't the end of the world. Liz heard me. She was just coming back from work. She heard me with a few F-bombs, but they were milder F-bombs. They weren't like the nasty ones from last week when I got really, really frustrated and lost 45 minutes of my work. But I want to thank you for listening to the podcast. If you want to support the podcast, you can always leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Better yet, share this podcast with somebody that you think would find value in these stark reflections. But until next week and until next episode, this is, as always, Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you, dear listener, great writing and good stark reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.